Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of State of Mind. This will be Part 29, Chapter 19, entitled My Beast. He shot upward, a scream strangled in the back of his throat, and a nightmare fading within his mind. His eyes were wide open, and his fists were clenched in his blankets, his breathing rapid and in short gasps. Where was he? Lights gently hovering and dancing through the air reminded Izuku of the dorms at UA. They reminded him that he was okay. He was safe. This knowledge did nothing to ease the feeling of immense pressure on Izuku's chest. Izuku sat there for an unknown amount of time, until finally the weight of Wink on his lap reached his senses, and he burst into tears, bending in half to bury his face in her fur. His head hurt, and so did his heart, and he recalled what Shoto had told him earlier about getting him when he needed something. But should he? What time was it even? With shaky hands, Izuku grabbed his phone from where it was connected to the wall. He frowned, his face pained. It was only just past an hour since he had laid down to sleep. It was barely even into the night, and he was sure that Shoto would still be awake. He had mentioned at some point that there were still things he had to finish with his room. He probably wouldn't be bothering him if he went to him for help. So before he could convince himself not to go, Izuku stuffed his phone under his armpit and scooped up Wink into his arms to hold against his chest, and then climbed out of his nook, the space lights flickering across his body as he made his way to the door. He opened it quietly, in case anyone really was sleeping, and then closed it, taking a few steps to the side to rap gently on Shoto's door. There was a soft shuffling from behind the wood before it swung open, and a confused Shoto peered at him, his usual countenance softening when he realized who it was, and he saw Izuku's swollen red eyes. He opened the door wider and stepped to the side, a silent invitation. Izuku walked in, his bare feet sliding onto the tatami flooring. Shoto sat down on a futon that was spread on the floor and gestured for Izuku to join him. Izuku sat down in front of him and released Wink, who simply curled up between the two of them and a little to the side, on the soft futon, perfectly content. "Nightmare?" Shoto asked, folding his legs. Izuku nodded, embarrassed. "Do you want to talk about it, or do you want to be distracted?" Izuku lifted his head back up, eyes widening, when he realized that Shoto had every intention of helping him, just like he'd said he would. Izuku was surprised. More often than not, people would say that they would help him, but ultimately had the intention of hurting him. Except for recently. His friend's eyebrows raised at him, and Izuku lifted a hand, 2 fingers held up. "Distraction?" Shoto asked, and Izuku nodded. His dreams weren't something he was comfortable talking about, especially to Shoto, who probably had his own troubles to deal with. Izuku didn't want to add to it. Shoto tapped his chin thoughtfully before the corner of his mouth quirked up, and he stood, going to a brown cabinet and pulling out of it a small black box. "You like bright colors, right?" he asked as he sat down and opened the box. Izuku nodded, leaning forward curiously. Shoto lifted a small towel out of the box and laid it down, before grabbing several small glass bottles from within the box as well, and setting them out. "Fuyumi gets nightmares too. We all do. But she and I used to distract ourselves by painting each other's nails and talking shit about Endeavor." Izuku noted that he used Endeavor instead of Dad. Shoto shrugged as he set things up, glancing up at the green-haired boy. "Want me to paint your nails, Izuku?" Izuku had never painted his nails before, but it sounded nice, so he nodded rapidly, and Shoto gave him a small smile. "What colors?" he asked. Izuku frowned and then offered his own shrug. Shoto looked down at his colors before removing an unopened bottle of what looked like shiny neon yellow. "I don't have many bright colors. I've only ever had black or red and white. But Fuyumi got me this one a long time ago as a joke. It's kind of neon, I guess. Like that scarf you wear." Izuku stiffened, reaching up with a trembling hand, realizing that he wasn't wearing it. He took a deep breath and told himself that it didn't matter. "Want to set your hand here?" Shoto asked softly, and Izuku looked back at him, swallowing thickly before nodding and setting his hand down on the towel, grimacing when he saw how much his hand was shaking. "Sorry," he whispered, voice rough. "It's okay. I'm used to shaky hands, don't worry." Shoto uncapped the nail polish, and the acrid smell permeated the air as he leaned forward with a small nail file. Izuku tried his best to keep his hands still as the boy worked. "Nightmares suck, huh?" Shoto asked open-endedly, leaving room for Izuku to speak if he wanted. Yeah, Izuku stuttered, clearing his throat, watching the top of Shoto's head, where a few red strands crossed into the white territory. He must not have brushed it in a while. "Haven't seen your nails painted before." Izuku tried to force himself to speak, to fill the silence. He wanted to hear Shoto's voice. "I don't do it very often, and I usually take it back off pretty quickly," Shoto answered, focusing on Izuku's bitten-to-bits nails as he set the file down and pulled over the brush that had been resting in the open bottle of nail polish. He bet his nails were hard to paint with how short and unkempt they were. "Why?" Izuku tilted his head. "If you like it, you should leave it." Shoto looked up, brows drawn together in apparent confusion. "I suppose that you're right." He went back to painting Izuku's nails. They were silent for a moment before Shoto changed the topic. "Are you ready for class tomorrow? We've been gone a while." He hovered a bit over the space of Izuku's missing finger sadly, before getting his thumbnail with a small brush. Izuku sighed. "I'm ready for things to be normal again." Shoto nodded. "I know what you mean. Other hand." Izuku switched hands, keeping the one with wet polish on it away so that it wouldn't smudge. Wink lifted her head and sniffed at his hand, recoiling at the smell and shoving her face under her tail. As Shoto worked on Izuku's nails, the vice squeezing Izuku's chest slowly but surely began to lessen. Shoto filed and painted his last fingernails and told Izuku to blow on them before cleaning everything up. "Thank you," Izuku murmured, holding his hands out in front of him to admire them. They were painted a bright yellow, a happy color. It made him feel good to look at them. "Are you good to go back to your room, or do you want to stay longer?" Shoto asked, and Izuku looked down at his now neon nails. "I think I'm okay now. Thank you, Shoto." He met warm, mismatched eyes with his own. Shoto shrugged. "I hope you're able to sleep better. You can come over or message me if you need anything." "You sound like Aizawa," Izuku sighed. "I do?" Shoto leaned back. He hadn't taken Aizawa for the type to say something like that to a student. Yeah." Izuku cleared his throat nervously, then shook his head. "I'll see you in the morning." Izuku turned around and left the room, only realizing afterward that his stuttering had stopped. Wink followed at his feet as Izuku wandered back to his room. He left the light off and climbed into his nook, pulling his phone and pen out so that he could write. He was glad he was able to write in the dark with the phone and reminded himself to thank Yagi again. It really was perfect for him. The next morning, Izuku got up early since he hadn't been asleep anyway and went to the kitchen to make a cup of coffee. He was surprised to see that Shinso was already there, sitting at the table with a mug in one hand and his phone in the other. He looked up when Izuku walked in, frowning. "Shouldn't you be sleeping? It's only—" He glanced at his phone. 3. "You too," Izuku responded snarkily, before locating the things he'd need to make coffee. Shinso huffed in response, otherwise not reacting to the fact that Izuku had spoken at all, for which he was immensely grateful. "Make me another cup, would ya?" The purple-haired boy pushed his mug toward Izuku, who nodded and grabbed it. He glanced at the design on the side before raising a brow at Shinso. "Don't look at me like that. I like cats, okay?" Shinso looked away. The mug was all black with cat ears on the top and a silver cat's face on the side of it, and the handle was the cat's tail. Izuku shrugged and let the coffee percolate, setting the mug by the pot and leaning against the counter with a wide yawn. "Tired?" Shinso asked, laying his head down sideways on his arms to look at Izuku, who only hummed in response before scratching at one of the new, raised scars on his face. The coffee finished, and Izuku poured out the bitter liquid into 2 mugs, assuming that Shinso liked it black after he'd ordered that triple espresso. Izuku crossed the room to sit in front of him, sliding the mug over before leaning back in his seat to invite Wink to jump onto his legs. She remained standing, leaning against his stomach while he drank his coffee. "You should probably eat something, too," Shinso muttered, his purple eyes looking tiredly at him over the rim of his cup. Izuku grunted in response, but looked up when Aizawa walked in his hero uniform, eyes half-lidded. He reached for the newly made pot of coffee and grabbed a mug, pouring himself a cup. "Don't all the teachers have their own kitchen?" Shinso was looking at Aizawa strangely. "I wanted to make sure everything was all right over here," the man said gruffly, locating cinnamon to pour into his cup. "Damn it, where are the spoons?" Izuku lifted a hand and a silver spoon appeared in his hand. He offered it to Aizawa, who gave him the weirdest look. "I am not sticking that thing in my coffee. What even is in your mindscape?" He shook his head. From in front of him, Shinso snorted and then sighed heavily, like a world-weary old man. "Utensils are in the top drawer to your left, I believe." Aizawa found the spoons and then stirred his coffee, while Izuku shoved a spoon back into his mindscape. Who knew when he would need it? Shinso looked back at the green-haired boy. "Why did you have a spoon in your mindscape anyway, Izuku?" Izuku shrugged and took a gulp of still way too hot coffee, burning his tongue, as he always seemed to do. "Tsukauchi has been asking after your testimony," Aizawa said abruptly, causing Izuku to choke on the hot liquid, coughing as he inhaled sharply, and it burned the back of his throat. Aizawa walked forward to pat his back, frowning. "Are you all right?" he asked. Izuku nodded, clearing his throat and rubbing his neck. "You don't have to do it today, or even tomorrow, but as soon as possible, problem child." Izuku sat up straighter, very aware of Shinso watching him from the other side of the table. Tomorrow, he said hoarsely. "Are you sure?" his teacher asked, returning to the counter to pick up his coffee. Izuku nodded. "First, after class today, I want to speak to you, and Mike probably, with Yagi." Aizawa's brows creased in confusion, but he shrugged. "All right. I'll make sure Mike is available. I trust you'll bring Yagi." Izuku nodded. "Okay. Well, I'll go find Mike. Class doesn't start for another couple of hours. Maybe you two should get some rest." Shinso scoffed against the table, where his face was pressed into it, and Izuku only grimaced. Aizawa sighed before shaking his head with exasperation and leaving the room. There was a short moment of silence before Shinso spoke up. "So, who's Yagi?" "Family friend," he answered flatly, and went back to his coffee, eyes closed. Shinso hummed in response before closing his own eyes as he laid against the table, neither of them sleeping, but both relaxing until the expected chaos of the day would begin. All right, listeners, this concludes the first half to Chapter 19 of State of Mind. Then the second half of this chapter will be up next. Personally, I like this chapter for a lot of different components. We get to see Izuku getting supported by several different people throughout this period. We see Aizawa kind of coming in and checking in over there. Some humor and chaos when it comes to Izuku pulling spoons out of his mindscape, which blew my mind when I first listened to it. And also, on top of that, Todoroki painting Izuku's nails, which I thought was some really nice fluff and support there. Izuku breaking out of the stuttering with him as well. And then also Shinso and him being up late at night too. So let me know what you all thought about this chapter. The rest of it will be up next. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.